It's my pleasure to introduce one of the widest ranging intellectuals writing on the American scene now. Hedrick Smith broke his journalistic teeth reporting on the civil rights movement in the American South in the early 1960s. Knew John Lewis, knew about the sit-ins, and that prepared him for assignments in Saigon and Cairo, and then the Plum in Paris. He was bureau chief for the New York Times in both Moscow and in Washington, D.C. He won in this era 2 Pulitzer prizes, one for his role in the Pentagon Papers, and another for his reporting on Moscow from Russia and from Eastern Europe. He's written a string of bestsellers, including one entitled The Russians, and one called The Power Game, which is one of the few books in Washington that the power brokers read to find out how they should be playing the game. He has moved to doing television, has sponsored, written, produced 26 different television programs ranging across the entire American experience, from Walmart to Wall Street to Dave Brubeck. I could go on and on, but you want to hear from him, not me. Please welcome Hedrick Smith to Brown. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks to all of you for taking some of your time this afternoon, although it's nice to be inside out of that great Providence spring that you threw. Fortunately, Washington is under the same clouds. I'm not going to talk about the campaign, at least unless you drag me into it, but I do want to start from the campaign because it's such a wonderful canvas. I can't remember as wild, raw, nasty, angry, troublesome upheaval in American political campaigns, I think, since 1968. That's the last one we've had quite like this. And to me, it's interesting not in terms of the horse race, which my colleagues are all worried about, and the collection of delegates or the cheating of delegates or the stealing of delegates. But I'm interested in the campaign as an MRI of America. How do we go from the campaign into our society? What do we see? If I were a foreign correspondent covering Washington and covering America today, what would I be writing about? Aside from the delegate count, what would I be learning about this country? And it's taken the press, I think, about 6 months to get to this part of the story. You're now seeing in the last month or so, I've seen a lot more of the stories that I think should have been written last fall at least. But in any case, we're starting to get into it, and that's what I'm interested in getting into with you today. I think one of the things that I would say immediately, and you might say it too as well, is that this campaign has changed the axis of conflict. Normally the axis is right and left, right? It's on a graph, it's on that horizontal line. The axis now is up and down. It's up and down in both parties. So we have a populist rebellion going on in each political party today, challenging what's euphemistically called the establishment. What they mean is the power brokers who are used to running the party. How many stories have you read in the last several weeks saying, quoting somebody saying, somebody, i.e. Trump, is stealing our party? Well, wait a minute, who gave you the ownership of the party? The assumption is it's our party. The assumption of the elite is it's ours. So what you have going on is this challenge, and to a certain degree, there's a why doesn't Bernie go away feeling among the Democratic establishment as well. So there's a similar sense of ownership. All right, it's fine. You can go out and run a few things. You can run in a few primaries, go to the Iowa caucuses, show up in New Hampshire. Of course, we're going to kill you in South Carolina. And you can go on a little bit, but by the time we get to the Midwest, get out of our way. You're messing us up. We need to get to the general. We need to focus on the other party. This is not happening. And the fact that it's not happening this late tells you something else that's important. And that is the depth and the breadth of the unhappiness, the depth and the breadth of the disenchantment. The issue is inequality. It's inequality of power as well as inequality of income. It is absolutely central. Whatever the issues you're hearing about, whether it's trade agreements or Wall Street speeches or whatever, all that is lingo, it's rhetoric It's wrapping around the issue of inequality of power and income. And it is deeply troubling this country. And I will contend today that long after the victor is known in this year's presidential campaign, we will still be talking about and addressing this issue. And I'm not sure if we're in American history, whether we're really at 1860 or we're rather somewhere around 1852. I have a sense that we're not watching the final chapters of this argument about power and the inequality in America. We're a seriously divided country. We're divided by money, we're divided by power, and we're divided by whom we trust. Think about it. I mean, if you can step back from your own feelings about Trump and the outrageous bigotry and authoritarianism and ignorance of the world and all these terrible things that he said, spoken, and represents, and just sort of ask yourself, as an analyst, how the hell can so many people, millions, be voting for him? Doesn't make sense to you, all right? Get out of your skin and go to find out where they are. And the answer is they don't trust the rest of them. They've turned down a governor from Texas, who, in my opinion, they should have turned down, but it's a governor from a big state. They turned down a sitting governor from New Jersey. They turned down a lousy governor from Louisiana, and they turned down a pretty good governor from Florida. So all those things that should give people credibility, weight, and connection with the voters didn't count. So why? What is it that's going on in the body politic and in the society that we live in, that we're learning about? We're deeply divided, as I said, and there's a loss of faith in America. Part of the problem, we have some very good pollsters in this country, and polling has become very hard to do in this country for all kinds of reasons, mostly having to do with cell phones and people's mistrust. But there's a loss of faith and a loss of trust in all kinds of institutions. And what the polls that are really interesting, that are worth following, are not the ones that tell you that it used to be Obama's rating was down. Now Obama's up over 50% now, which in the current political atmosphere is actually pretty good. But Congress is way down. We in the media are way down. The lawyers are way down. The ministers are way down. The Catholic Church is down, on and on and on. What's really interesting is not just the opinion of people about the politicians, but the loss of faith in our political system. If you look, I saw one poll that said 91% of the people think the political system in America is broken. 91%. You can read poll after poll after poll, and this goes back probably 12, 13 years, and find that 70 to 80% of the people say lobbyists have too much power in Washington. Corporations have too much power in Washington. People in Washington don't listen to people like me. The wording varies one way or another, but people have got it. They're disconnected. So politicians who come to them, and what we haven't had before is we haven't had the translation of people's opinion in polls about general attitudes translated in the way people vote. But we're now starting to see it come through in the voting. And politicians start to take that a lot more seriously, which then begins to make the political game a lot more interesting, both to follow and to get involved in. But there's this loss of faith, there's this disenchantment out there. 91% say the system is broken. I saw two polls, one of which said 60% of the people said America is in decline. America is in decline. Another poll said 63% said America is in decline. We've seen our best days. Our kids are not going to do as well as we are. The students we're teaching today can't look forward to as good a future as we have had in our past. It's really dramatic. John Gardner, and this isn't just this year, I'm trying to get beyond this year, just use this campaign as an indicator, as a litmus test, as a canary in the coal mine, not as a reality that we want to study in detail itself. But John Gardner said, I think about 2005, 2006, before he died, we're walking the edge of a precipice here. Civilizations die of disenchantment. Not politicians lose, not countries have debts. Civilizations die of disenchantment. If enough people lose faith in their society, he said, the whole thing begins to fall apart. I would contend that that's where we are. I would contend that's where we are. And if we start thinking about our problems and our issues in our society and what we should do, it seems to me we need to get somewhere near that as a starting place. And part of the difficulty is too much of the analysis and too much of the recommendations don't get anywhere near to the right beginning place. So we don't have much chance of really doing much more than tinker around the edges. You know, you look at Washington. Look what we've now just come to take for granted in Washington, okay? They not only can't pass a budget, and you have to understand, I've been around Washington long enough where budgets actually got passed every year, and 13 appropriations bills got passed along with them. That was fairly routine. We don't pass a budget anymore. We pass a continuing resolution. Do you know what a continuing resolution is? It is an acknowledgement that we cannot come to the collective policy agreement represented in a budget, so we're just going to kick the ball a little bit further down the field and continue to do what we've been doing. A continuing resolution, which is now hailed in the media as a success, is actually a policy failure. So we have that just for starters. We had a situation not long ago, and I covered foreign affairs for a long time. I'd never seen anything like this in my whole reporting career. 40-plus Republican senators wrote a foreign government and told them not to trust an agreement then being negotiated by an American president. They wrote to the leaders of Iran, they wrote to Khamenei and said, don't make this deal with Obama on regulating your nuclear weapons because you can't count on the next president after Obama to keep it. Unheard of, unbelievable. When you think of all the things we went through in the Cold War and the bipartisan politics ended at the water's edge was a rule that governed American politics, certainly through World War II, and I would say throughout the Cold War, at least until Gorbachev came and visited Reagan, and well beyond that. It was phenomenal. And now we just take it for granted. You know, we're not going to have a Supreme Court justice for the next 8 or 10 months. So one of the principal institutions in our democracy is going to be hornswoggled, basically, by 4-4 ties on a whole number of important issues. And that's just politics. Think of the dysfunctional failure that represents, those two things. I don't need to go on through the list for you. You know, when I think of Washington, I'm reminded a little bit of one of my favorite cartoons. It's the Charlie Brown one, it's Peanuts. It's the one where Lucy has set up a card table in the backyard, and it says psychiatry 1 cent. Well, you know who walks up. Charlie Brown walks up, he puts down his penny, and he wants to get therapy from Lucy. And she says, well, Charlie, before I can give you any advice, I need to ask you a question. I need to have you think of life as a voyage on a great ocean liner. Now, she said there's some people, and they take their deck chairs and they take them back to the stern and they look back to see where they've come from. Oops. And there are other people, and they take their deck chairs up to the bow and they look into the future to see where they're going. Which group do you belong to? And Charlie scratched his head and thought for a moment. He said, Lucy, I'm having trouble getting my chair unfolded. So Washington is having trouble getting his chair unfolded. We laugh about it, but it isn't funny, and you can see that being played out today. And you can see it being played out in the polarization, this up-down division, the schisms, the rifts in American society. And as I was starting to write about it, work on this, I got thinking back to my days at Oxford when I read some of Arnold Toynbee. You know, he wrote that 12-volume History of Human Civilizations, 21 Civilizations, 6,000 Years. I want to say right off the bat, I did not read all 12 volumes. I read an abridged 2-volume summary, which is a pretty hefty piece of work itself. And he tells the story of human civilizations in terms of the rise and fall of civilizations, in terms of challenge and response. Every civilization is faced with one or multiple challenges, and it either sustains itself and rises and carries on by meeting that with an effective response, or it fails to meet it with an effective response and it disappears. And he goes way back, and he starts talking, as I recall, with a challenge that I wouldn't have thought of, which is an environmental challenge. I mean, he talks about the Inca civilization in Latin America, and he talks about the Egyptian civilization on the Nile and the challenge of a hostile environment. Could they even establish an effective agricultural economy that would feed people and nourish a civilization? And of course they did. We know that from the the temples in Machu Picchu, they not only grew enough stuff to feed everybody, but they built those magnificent buildings, and the same thing with the pyramids and all the great ruins that we see up and down the Nile. But they fell victim to another challenge, and that's the challenge of an outside military invader. The Spaniards in the case of the Incas, and the Ottoman Turks in the case of the Egyptians. And that outside invader challenge is one that we're used to. We as Americans know something about that. We've dealt with that. We dealt with that in World War I a bit, but really in World War II with Hitler, and then eventually in the Cold War with Stalin and the communists. But what he goes on to talk about, Toynbee, that's so interesting is the challenge that was really fatal to the civilizations that we most admire, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, was a challenge from within. Internal conflicts, what Toynbee calls schisms in the soul of the society, schisms in the body politic. And when I hit that and thought about that, I thought, this is what we're looking at here in America today. We have a challenge today which is internal, which goes way beyond this election and will continue to go way beyond this election, that we need to cope with, or we literally are what those 60 or 63% of the people told those pollsters. We're on our way down. And there's hope. I think we can do something about it. But we do have to recognize, I think, the depths of the problem, and we have to understand how we got into it. I don't think there's a chance in hell that we can deal with it if we don't understand how we got into it. And the normal explanation for where we are and for the economic inequality today, and it's interesting that the focus of a lot of the debate in the campaign is on trade, is basically this is globalization. This is modern technology coming in, destroying old industries, the horse and buggy going its way and being replaced by the car, and then the computer coming along and replacing all kinds of other things, and the internet coming along and basically running us print media guys off the map and so forth, and that this is sort of inevitable. And there's really not much we can do about it. Relax, folks, adjust, learn new skills, and move on. And certainly there's truth to that, but it's a half-truth and it's misleading. If it were the whole truth, we'd see replications of America all across the globe, and we don't. If you look at German society, if you look at other advanced economies, they don't have anywhere near the inequality of income that we do. They have very different social institutions. They have different attitudes, different ways about going about problem solving, which we might learn from, though we're very proud about not learning from other people if it's not invented here. But you don't see that. The economists have come up with a thing called the Gini coefficient, which essentially measures how unequal a society is. They have to go through all kinds of complicated computations, but if you're absolutely, everybody is totally equal, your society gets a rating of 0. And if Bill Gates owned it all, we'd have a rating of 1. And so if it's really unequal, well, if it's really unequal and you're European, your rating is somewhere between 0.25 and 0.33 or something like that. We're off the chart. We're up at 0.47. There's no other country anywhere near us. And you don't have to take my word for it. Citibank put out a report in 2005 to its wealthiest clients talking about investment opportunities, and they said invest in the companies that cater to the top 1 or 2% because there's so much concentrated purchasing power and wealth in those that 1 or 2%, that's where the money can be made best. And in the process, they said we had a degree of inequality of income that among major powers in world history was the greatest since 16th century Spain. Okay, that's 500 years. That's a pretty good yardstick. We're off the charts. The question is, how did we get here? And was this inevitable? And was it ever different? If there was something different, is there something we can learn from it? Well, I've been around long enough, and so have some of you, judging by the hair color and some of the people in the room, that I think I remembered a greater or more shared prosperity when I came out of Williams and went into the marketplace and so forth. But, you know, you're white-haired, you got to be careful, because there's a tendency to say, you know, back when I was a young boy, everything was just fine. If we just get back to where we were, we fix everything up. So I decided I better go back and check. What's interesting is if you look at the period from the end of World War II, 45, until the mid-late 70s, and see what happened to wealth and growth in this country, the productivity of the American workforce, which is the driving force for growth, increased productivity, increased technology, went up 97%. And the median hourly pay and benefits of the average worker went up 95% during that period. 97 and 95. In other words, as the technology was introduced, as the economy became more global, as we became more efficient, as the corporations made more power and we had enormous growth, the middle class standard of living was going right up with it. It was right on an escalator with that going up. Really interesting that that was going on. And if you actually look at what economists like to do, which is cut us up into quintiles, top 20%, second 20%, bottom 20%, the average income in all 5 quintiles moved up pretty much in tandem. In fact, the ones in the bottom 2 quintiles moved up just a little bit faster than the one at the top. I'm not saying we had convergence. I'm not saying we had equality at all. Charlie Wilson, the head of GM, the best paid executive back during that period, probably made 35 times as much pay as the average General Motors worker. But 35 times today, they're within shouting distance of each other. Today it's 300, and 2 or 3 years ago, Tim Cook, who runs Apple, made 4,622 times as much as the average Apple worker. And I'm not talking about the workers who are Chinese overseas. I'm talking the ones who are in this country here. So, I mean, it's changed enormously. So there was some shared wealth and some convergence in the sense that the distance from the top to the middle to the bottom wasn't that great. Did we have business booms and cycles? Yes. Did we have poverty? Yes. Did we have problems? Yes. I'm not suggesting any of that away. I'm just trying to give you some indicators that you can compare to today. So the question is, how did we do that? What drove that kind of society? And 2 things matter. It's interesting. You keep coming across this in history. It seems as though it's not true, but it is. 2 things matter, ideas and power. The idea that mattered at that time, that made that possible, was the leaders of American businesses. The Charlie Wilsons at General Motors, the Reg Jones at General Electric, Frank Abrams at Standard Oil of New Jersey, Remington at Coca-Cola, on and on, Irving Shapiro at DuPont. All those guys believed it was smart business, and it was the duty of the CEO to balance the economic interests of all the stakeholders in the corporation. Stakeholders is an enormously important word and concept. Everybody who had a stake in that corporation had to do well, or the corporation couldn't do well. That was the central idea. And when you read the statements of these guys and what they say, I mean, they'll talk about ethics, they talk about moral responsibility, and they talk about it in definitely ethical and sometimes almost religious terms. And Peter Drucker, you know, the management guru from Southern California, from Claremont University, I mean, he's running around the country teaching this, and business schools are teaching this, okay? It was absolutely central to the paying of lots of middle-class people lots of money. And the idea behind that was what economists call the virtuous circle of growth. If you pay tens of millions of middle-class Americans well, they don't save a lot of it. They might be buying a mortgage. They might save a bit for their kids' education. Back then, they weren't saving much at all for retirement. We're still not saving enough for retirement. But if you paid them, they spent it. And that generated the consumer demand that drove the economy. So you had this process of paying people well, robust consumer demand, which generated, you know, higher production, the need for new factories, new equipment, new technologies, and hiring more workers. That is the basic secret of America's phenomenal growth from the end of World War II up until the late 1970s. And that idea has changed, but that is absolutely central. So that idea was critical. The other thing that was really important to the way we had shared power and wealth, we're talking about unequal power and wealth now versus shared power and wealth before, was a vibrant citizen activism that was typical of that era. It's epitomized, in my experience, Jim referred to the civil rights movement. That was a movement to expand American democracy, to bring more people into both political and economic potential. But there was a women's movement at the same time. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, 51, 52 years ago. Women were making 41 cents on the dollar for doing the same work as men. We're not all the way there yet, but we're about twice as high. We're up in the 80, 82% now. And women were demonstrating. Women were active politically. Gosh, I remember men in that period were buffaloed and baffled. Women went braless. We didn't know what to do, whether or not to be excited or what. And women were saying, notice us and give us a fair shake. And it had a tremendous impact on public policy. 1963, John F. Kennedy signed one of the first equal employment payment pieces of legislation in American history. So there was a direct impact, just like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement. There was a strong labor movement that demanded bargaining and being part of the economic compact that was prevalent all over the country. I mean, after we came out of World War II and there were a lot of wildcat strikes and so forth, Charlie Wilson at General Motors wanted to get to work. He said, cut this out. Went to Walter Reuther, cut it out. We need to get back to work. You know, let's get the production going. And Walter Reuther said, sure, fine. Give us a good contract with wages rising 2 or 3% a year, with some kind of health benefit, with some kind of retirement benefit, and you got it. And Charlie Wilson said, that's a deal. And that became a template not only for union, and not only for the auto industry, the steel industry, the rubber industry, the electronics industry, the atomic industry, and all kinds of non-unionized companies all over the country. That was the deal. Labor peace, long-term employment, job security, production, profits. It worked really well. But it was countervailing power. It wasn't strictly managerial power. There was an environmental movement. Do you know on Earth Day, if we have there's demonstrations going on in Washington today. 400 people got arrested for protesting our broken political system, and they're going to be more. And I'm going to get down there next week and do a little filming of some of that. It'll be fun to get back into that game again. 400 people. And I saw that in Birmingham when I was down in Birmingham. I saw that in Nashville many, many times. On Earth Day, 1970, April 22nd, it's just coming up. Yeah, I wonder how many people are going to be out on Earth Day this year. We've got another 10 days to go. That many years ago, there were 20 million Americans who went into the streets, went to college campuses like this, went to radio and television stations, went to talkathons, went to shopping malls. 20 million Americans, close to 10% of the population of the country at that time, 8% of the population. Enormous. Within 1 year, Congress passed 7 major pieces of environmental legislation. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Anti-Toxic Substance Act, on and on and on. Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first head of the EPA appointed by Nixon, is a friend of mine. I said to him at one point, Bill, have I missed something? Was Richard Nixon a closet greenie and we just didn't know about it? He said, Rick, in all the years I worked for him, he never once asked me, Bill, is it bad out there? Is it really true that if you put your arm into the Potomac River, it comes out covered with green slime because of the nitrogen and phosphorus pollution which causes the algae and hence the slime? He said he never once asked me. He said, but he did say one thing to me. He said, Bill, when you get over there, don't let the bureaucrats at EPA capture you. EPA. Ruckelshaus said Nixon, who had created the EPA, was the only person in Washington who didn't know the acronym was EPA and he thought it was EPA. He said that's how engaged Nixon was. I said, so why did he do it? Why did he sign all this legislation? He said the people were demanding it. The public was demanding action. People were demonstrating. People were marching. People were showing up in congressional offices. There was a huge, by all those pieces of legislation I mentioned to you, they passed by 88-4, 92-1. I mean, the bipartisan support for those things was just enormous. And he said, this is the way democracy is supposed to work. Interesting idea. The people spoke, the people demanded it, we in government are supposed to respond. That's how democracy works. That was the syllogism that Ruckelshaus repeated to me, which made a lot of sense back in that era and almost sounds funny today, which is a tragedy. That was the deal. People also demanded that the tops and the bottoms not be that far apart. There was a fairly regular process that the minimum wage was raised, again, by huge bipartisan majorities. Again, 70 to 80 people on both sides of the aisle were raising the minimum wage every 3 or 4 years, not on a regular schedule, but it was done regularly. Stopped in 1981, okay? The minimum wage today is more than 30% below 1968, adjusted for inflation. Okay? So the whole idea of fixing the economic bottom floor under the economy to generate that consumer demand, to get the virtuous circle of growth going again, is gone, okay? That's part of what happened, okay? So there was also a demand that the people at the top be taxed higher. Now, we're told today that if you raise the taxes significantly on the top 1 or 2%, or on those of us in the room, the top 10%, okay? The economy will come to a dead halt. We need a little history there. I went back and checked that. Under Eisenhower in the 1950s, Republican president, the top marginal tax rate was 92%. Under Kennedy, it got cut to 77%. It stayed at that level for a long time until Reagan came down and dropped it down to 35%, okay? Under Obama and George W. Bush, the top marginal tax rate for a decade was 35%. The average annual growth rate in the 50s and the 60s, when the tax rate was high, was between 3% and 3.1%. And the average annual growth rate during the decade of the 2000s, including the period prior to the financial collapse, was 1%. High taxes, high growth rate, low taxes, low growth rate, okay? I'm not saying there's a connection. I'm saying there is no connection. It's nonsense. But people back then wanted a fair economy. And they got both a fair economy and a 3% growth rate, okay? That's very important, because if you're talking about how to generate jobs and how to start to deal with the people who are so enthusiastic at the moment about Trump, particularly about Trump, but also about Bernie, you got to generate the kind of jobs that will give them the kind of standard of living that lets them go back to raise their families instead of coming out in the streets and rallies to a guy who says, if you don't give me the nomination, there'll be riots, okay? There is a connection, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I'm simply trying to suggest here. So what went wrong? What went wrong was ideas and power changed. It's ironic, the citizen movements, women's movement, civil rights movement, environmental movement, in some ways were so successful, their success put them out of business. There was an assumption that you could turn the job over to the public. You could turn the job over to the government. If you passed all those environmental laws, then that was taking care of that. If you raised the minimum wage, that was taking care of that. If you passed the legislation dealing with equal pay for the opposite gender, that was dealing with that. So part of it was success spoiled Rock Hudson. I mean, people said, oh, well, the job's done, we can go back to doing other things. But part of it wasn't that at all. There was a deliberate, it's like Newtonian physics, there was a deliberate opposite and equal and even more powerful reaction. There was a political revolt of the bosses, which actually begins well before Reagan. Maybe you're not surprised if you think back to Barry Goldwater in '64, but what's really interesting is it begins to take root in the 70s. There's a guy who's famous for other reasons named Lewis Powell, who was put on the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon in late 1971. He actually went on the court in 1972. Powell was a famous corporate attorney from Richmond, Virginia, very close to people at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and very upset by the power of labor unions, by the power of Ralph Nader and the consumer movement, and by the power of both the environmental and the women's movement and the civil rights movement, all of which he felt were impinging on the profits, the efficiency, and the freedom and flexibility of American corporate leadership. And he went to his friends at the Chamber of Commerce and he said this, and they said, hey, you're a lawyer, write us a brief. He went and wrote what I think is the most ignored or underappreciated document in American history of the last 50 years, the Lewis Powell Memo of August 1971. And I persuaded Random House to print the whole memo in the back of my book, Who Stole the American Dream. What Powell did was he basically was a Paul Revere for the corporate world. He wrote a corporate manifesto. He said, you are getting killed by all these movements, particularly by organized labor, but by Nader and by these others. You got to go organize and get down to Washington. You got to pool your resources financially. You got to plan for the long term. You got to take the political high ground. You got to play dirty ball. You got to get nasty. You got to get tough with your political opponents. And believe it or not, that's what happened. Not because Powell was that personally influential, but because business leaders were ready and waiting for somebody to sort of articulate their frustration and give them a plan. I couldn't believe it when I went back through the history. And you have to understand, I was a Washington correspondent and indeed a bureau chief through much of this, and I saw the symptoms, but I really didn't know what the causes were until I went back to write this book, and I learned so much. I was embarrassed. I was both thrilled and embarrassed by how much I learned every week. At the time that Powell wrote his memo, there were only 175 companies that even had offices in Washington. 8 years later, before Reagan gets into office, there are 2,425. The National Association of Manufacturers, which had been headquartered in Chicago, moved to Washington. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce doubled its staff and tripled its budget. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, the organization of small businesses, grew in membership between 1971 and 1980 from 3,000 to 600,000. By 1980, before Reagan is elected, there are 50,000 people working for business trade associations in Washington. There are 9,000 registered corporate lobbyists, and there are 8,000 corporate PR people. There is a veritable army. I call it Powell's Army. Powell's Army actually goes to work, and the pivot of policy in American history actually occurs with the Democrats in control of both houses of Congress and a fellow named Jimmy Carter in the White House. The pivotal year is 1978. It is the year where they rewrote the corporate tax laws. They established the 401k program. They changed the corporate bankruptcy law. They dropped the capital gains tax from 48% to 28%. It was just phenomenal change. And they began the deregulation of the trucking and the communications industries. It goes on. It accelerates. The tax cuts really come under Reagan. But it's important to understand that it wasn't so much the election of Reagan that did it. The pendulum had already begun to swing in the late 70s under Carter. And Reagan is really an accelerator. The tax cuts under Reagan, if you look at the inequality of wealth today, are enormously important. They've added $1 trillion to the wealth of the top 1% every decade. That's $1 trillion in the 80s, $1 trillion in the 90s, and $1 trillion in the 2000s. And the George W. Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 added another trillion. So that's $4 trillion. So this political power swing that occurred, and I don't know if I got time to go into the Gang of Six, but the way the business lobbies organized subsequent to 1978, it just dominates the writing, particularly of economic policy legislation and tax legislation. And if there's any indication of who runs power in Washington and how the power game is played, it is the writing of tax policy. That tells you who's in charge, and the chances are that power and influence is rippling out in all kinds of other policies. So when you see those enormous tax cuts under Reagan, you also need to know that the regulations on the financial industry are radically changing, which sets up all the conditions that happen for the housing boom and bust that hits in the late 90s and into the 2000s. I mean, there are all kinds of antecedents that come. I mean, think of the unintended consequences. It's a huge shift for the middle class when you go from 1980, when 84% of the workers for companies with more than 100 employees had lifetime pensions from their companies, which meant you got a check every month from the day you retired until the day you died. That is a financial security on top of Social Security that's phenomenal for the middle class, which it doesn't have today. And it gets replaced by a 401k tax plan. 401k. If you were going to dream up a revolutionary reformist tax plan, would you call it 401k? No, you wouldn't. It's called 401k because it's buried so far in the tax code that it's 401 paragraphs down and it's subparagraph K, i.e. nobody knew what was going on. It wasn't intended to do what it's doing now. It was intended as a tax shelter for deferred income from the profit sharing of a bunch of New York banks and Xerox and Kodak, and it was put in the tax code by Barbara Conable, a Republican congressman from upstate New York who happened to have Xerox and Kodak headquarters in his home district. That's how legislation gets written. That's how national policy got written. It all got transformed, and I tell the story in the book. But my point is, these kinds of things were all, and it happened in '78. It happened under the Democrats, and it happened under Jimmy Carter. I'm not trying to put political blame here. I'm simply trying to open the textbook so we can look at it in a kind of an honest way and then figure out, is that a smart way to go? What should we do about it? So that's what happened. Policy change, power change, ideas changed. Question, can we do anything about it? Well, what's interesting to me as a reporter, and thank God I did start in the South, and thank God I did become a foreign reporter, because the worst thing in the American media today is the concentration of reporters, editors, producers, airtime, and space in Washington, D.C. As a foreign correspondent in Moscow, I covered Russia. I could only get, it was closed in the Cold War. I could only travel to 40% of Russia, but 40% of Russia, or the Soviet Union back in those days, was a hell of a lot of territory, and I got out every time I could. I covered the civil rights all over the South for several summers, okay? When I was in Cairo, I traveled around the Arab world. I went to Yemen, I went to Sudan, I got lucky, I went up to Turkey. My point is I got out. If you're a Washington correspondent for almost any medium, you sit in Washington. What do you cover? Think about it. What do you cover in Washington? You cover words. You cover what people say about what reality is. How do you then learn anything about reality? You don't. The only reality you know is who's up or who's down in Washington. But in terms of reality, you don't. You have to get out into the country. That's one of the good things about political campaigns. It makes some Washington correspondents get out. But the problem is the only thing they're interested in is who's ahead. I mean, really, the only thing they're interested in. They're not interested in finding out about the country. They just want to know how the vote's going to be next Tuesday. And then after that, they don't care about Indiana or Wisconsin or whatever. Yeah, those people were unhappy about trade. Now, what's the next issue? What's the next state? So I'm hopeful about what we can do in this country because I'm here in Providence, and I've been in the last 3 years, I've probably been in 25 states in the country. I've spoken at 200 or 300 different places. And what's happening in America that is important is happening in the states. People, one of the most serious problems we have in our gridlock political system, I think I mentioned it to you before, is gerrymandering. Today, and it's a result of a couple of things. You don't have that problem in your congressional delegation. You might have it in your state. I don't know enough about your state legislature, but you've only got, am I right, one congressman? Two? You got two? We'll see.
But next census will be down to one.
Yeah, okay, all right. Well, then you've got a little bit of room. But in most states, gerrymandering is absolutely critical. And it is now done with sophisticated modern computer software. And it is also politically organized and highly financed. And a good political reporter today and a good political reporter a year ago could have told you the partisan outcome of this fall's November election for districts of Congress in 85 to 88% of the districts. The reason is they're political monopolies set up by both parties. Just north of you in Massachusetts and in my former home state of Maryland, it's the Democrats that do it. In Texas and in Wisconsin and in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and a lot of other places, Indiana and Ohio, it's Republicans that do it. And the numbers are absolutely astonishing. There was a Republican program called the Red Map, which was funded to the tune of about $30 million by a number of major American corporations. They deliberately set out to capture as many state legislatures as they could in 2010, because in 2011, with the census report, there's a redistricting. Nationwide, the Republicans were extremely clever and extremely successful, and the Democrats were totally asleep and got caught asleep at the switch. The Republicans picked up a total net 625 legislative seats nationwide. It left them in control of the governor's chair and both houses of the state legislature in states that controlled 40% of the seats in Congress. By contrast, the Democrats controlled 10%, and the other 50% had mixed. The governor, one party, or one house under control of one party, and the other house in control of the other. And the result was they did one hell of a job in the gerrymandering of 2011. And I can give you a few states. In 2012, the next election, in North Carolina, Democrats outvoted Republicans for congressional seats to the same degree they had in the previous election. In the previous election in 2010, Democrats had 7 of the North Carolina seats and Republicans had 6. After the Republican gerrymandering, the vote was almost identical. Republicans had 9 seats and Democrats had 4. Okay? In Pennsylvania, the Democrats outvoted the Republicans. In Pennsylvania, they have 18 seats, so it should come out 9-9, maybe 10-8. It came out 13-5. A Democratic state senator in Pennsylvania took the same numbers and redrew the district maps, and it came out 13-5 for the Democrats. So if you don't think the drawing of the lines makes much difference, it makes a huge difference. Nationwide, the Democratic vote for Congress was 1.5 million more than the Republican vote for Congress, but the Republicans wound up with a 33-vote majority in the House of Representatives. Now, that wasn't all gerrymandering. Some of it actually is simply the way people live, but a huge percentage was gerrymandering. Now, what's fascinating is there are now 21 states that are engaged in a fight against gerrymandering. There are 7 states that have set up independent redistricting commissions and taken it out of the hands of the legislature. They're not perfect, but they're a hell of an improvement. There are 6 other states where there are lawsuits that have been filed against the gerrymandering, and there are 8 other states, if my numbers are right, that have popular movements that are now engaged in it. And one of the most, and this is going on in the most amazing places. This is not like this is happening in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and California and Oregon and Washington State and nothing in between. The most dramatic gerrymander reform of the last 5 years occurred in Florida. At the same time the state of Florida was electing a heavily Republican legislature and a Republican governor, the voters passed by more than 60% a gerrymander reform to the state constitution that said you cannot redistrict, and they use this language, you cannot redistrict in a way that will favor one party over the other or will protect incumbents. The Republican legislature totally ignored that. Common Cause and a bunch of people took them to court. It's taken 4 or 5 years. The Florida Supreme Court has ordered the redrawing of district lines. And this fall, at least 3 seats will change party identification. And even if they don't change party identification, the fact that they're no longer gerrymandered means that independents and voters of the other party have more influence. In the state of Washington, they have a thing called the Top 2 primary, which is a nonpartisan primary. They used to have a slightly different system. Today in Washington State, they've been doing this now for about 4 or 5 congressional elections. There is no member, it isn't just the party lineup, there is no member of the Washington State congressional delegation that is in the outer 20% ideologically of the voting record of their party. They're all playing somewhere near midfield. One of the most disastrous consequences of the political battles we've had in the last 30 years in America is the missing middle. The middle's gone. They used to, they chart, political scientists chart the votes in Congress. They do them like Rorschach, little charts like this, okay? If you go back to the 60s and 70s, the 2 charts overlap. There were Democrats voting to the right of Republicans. There were Republicans, particularly from the north, the Saltonstalls and Clifford Case and Jake Javits of New York, people whose names you remember, you know, they were voting to the left of some Democrats. There was an overlap. And what happened was in the middle you could make the compromises that enable the government to work. The middle's gone now. Those Rorschach things like this, literally, it looks like the trenches in World War I. There's a no man's land in the middle between the parties. They're actually separated. There's almost no overlap. It's very, very rare. You can't have a government like ours work with that. Gerrymander reform is absolutely essential to actually getting the middle reestablished. In addition to the fact that they're party monopolies, today people are fleeing the parties. Today, 40% of the voters in America identify themselves as independents. And among the generation of the young people sitting over here on this side of the room, the figure is well over 50% and it's growing. People are totally disenchanted. So if we want our government to work, if we want our government to deal with climate change, to deal with foreign trade, to deal with Arab Israel, to deal with the budget, to deal with the entitlements, to deal with any issue, we got to get the government back so that it actually can talk to each other and you've got some of that overlapping center. So we got to do something about that. We got to do something about money in politics. You've got some good laws in Rhode Island. I went and looked them up today to be careful, so I'd be a little bit more informed. You have a good law on public disclosure that was passed in 2012. You have public funding of campaigns, which is really important to reducing the influence of mega donors in campaigns. But a small problem. Not enough money in it. Because what happened in the last race? The Republican candidate was the mayor of Cranston, Alan Fong, am I right? Okay. He takes public funding. Why? Because he's the underdog, he has trouble raising money. He can double his money, but Raimondo spends 3 times as much. And by the way, did you know? The story I read said 65% of her money came from out of state. Now, is that really the way you want to, I mean, whether she's a good governor or not, is that the way you want to pick? Do you want funders in New York? And if it can be done in New York, rest assured the Koch brothers will be here eventually, okay? So think about it. So are we going to do something about America? The answer is we've got to do it at the state level. We got to deal with gerrymander reform. We got to deal with money in politics. We got to deal with dark money. And we got to deal, well, you may not have a problem with voter turnout, but we got to make voter turnout easier and more attractive. When you have gerrymandered districts, and if you have gerrymandered legislative districts, what happens? Sometimes voters don't turn out. Sometimes the other party doesn't even bother to field a candidate. It got so bad in Indiana 2 years ago that in 42 of the legislative seats in the Indiana legislature, there was no opposition to the incumbent. I mean, democracy breaks down. Think back to what I said. We're walking the edge of a precipice here. Civilizations die of disenchantment. We're looking at people who are disenchanted. Are the people who are voting for Trump and are the people who are backing Bernie, are they thinking about all the things I'm talking about? No. Some of them are, but very few. But they understand something is really wrong and something is really fishy. And unless people like those of us in this room who are all fortunate, with our education, with our health, and probably with our finances, unless we get engaged and work on fixing this political and economic system of ours, we are going to do what the people are talking about. There's a wonderful story that I want to share with you, though. It's a story about Alfred Nobel. Alfred Nobel, you know, the famous Swedish munitions maker. Well, he didn't have a very great reputation during his life because he made his money making and selling arms. He had a brother who was involved in another field. As I recall, he was in classical literature and in the arts. And his brother dies before him. Great tragedy, younger than Alfred Nobel. And there's an obituary in a French newspaper, Francois. And a friend of his says, hey, there's an obituary of your brother in Francois, I'll send it to him. And he sends it to him. And it says, munitions maker dies. And Nobel reads it. And it's his. He said, my God, it's my obituary. It's not my brother's obituary. He says this to his friend. He said, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to him, me. And his friend says, no, it's not. It's the best thing that's ever happened to you. You can now go rewrite your obituary while you're alive. And that is when he set at the Nobel Prizes and he began to move in the direction of public service. So we can rewrite our own obituary if we decide to do that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that wide-ranging and fascinating and call in the night, I guess we'd have to call it. So we've got microphones. We've got some time for questions. I guess I'm going to grab the first question. You did a marvelous job doing something we try to do. We don't always succeed. And that is to be balanced. You come off as particularly Democratic or Republican. But a lot of us in academia have more and more trouble with this. We even have a word for it, asymmetrical polarization. And what that means is one party has polarized a whole lot more than the other. Now, you were very balanced in this, and I'd like your comment. Is it the argument for asymmetrical polarization says one party just went off the rails, that the Newt Gingrich idea is make people hate Washington, and it can only benefit the Republican Party. So let's not have any compromises. The other view is, you know, it's really, as a pox in both parties, having to do with money and all that stuff. Give us some advice. Where do you stand on that difficult issue?
I do try to do what you said. But I do think that there are 2 or 3 areas in which the Republican Party has broken away from what were sort of unwritten rules. You mentioned Newt Gingrich, and I don't think there's any question that Gingrich was critical. I don't think there's any question that Gingrich did come up with the idea, and he had it back in 1978 when he first appeared in Congress, that Tip O'Neill, who said all politics is local, was basically articulating a philosophy that every congressional race is its own, and that's going to work to the advantage of the Democrats and to our disadvantage. What we need to do as Republicans is to nationalize campaigns, and particularly nationalize them against the incumbent, and the incumbent is the president, therefore, if it's a Democratic Party. But Newt did some other things, and I did a documentary on Newt and his battle with Clinton called The People in the Power Game back in 2005? No, before that, way before that. But Newt did something else that was really damaging, and it has lasting effect. Prior to the class elected in 1994, which is known as the Gingrich class, because he had so much to do with it, class then elected him the speaker in the beginning of '95. Prior to that, all the junkets and trips and fact-finding missions that members of Congress went on, and all the orientation that new members of Congress went through was bipartisan. It was usually done at the Brookings Institution, or it was done at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And the notion was, it was a good idea to bring everybody together, have them have a common experience, and also give them a chance to get to know each other, because they're going to have to deal with each other. And Gingrich said, no, this did not fit his model. He wanted to drive a wedge between the parties. And so for the first time in the class of 1994, went and it had its orientation at the Heritage Foundation, which was a very different, ideologically very different, but also really divided them just in terms of personal contact. And you even began to see informal things like the playing of basketball and softball leagues and stuff like that, where members would mingle and get to know each other. You get to know each other. You can disagree about pieces of legislation or about issues, but the next day or 2 weeks later or 3 months later or even the following year, there's a time you need somebody and you know them a little bit and you can pick up the phone and call them. Evan Bayh, who became governor and then senator from Indiana, recalled his growing up in his father's home, Birch Bayh, senator from Indiana, and he said, every weekend we would have, now he was not just, interesting, he was not just talking about having Republicans in his family home, but Southern Democrats, which is like having a Republican. So he said everybody was there. So Gingrich definitely did that, and I don't think that there's anything that anybody on the Democratic Party did that was comparable to that. And the second thing I think that was really important is what I was just talking about. The Republican red map plan, I mean, before there'd been gerrymandering, my God, it was invented north of here, right? So it's been going on a long time. But nobody had ever, to my knowledge, in American history, had tried to nationalize gerrymandering before. This was a party's deliberate decision to go out and go after the assets they needed to gerrymander on a national basis and then lock up the control of the House for a decade. Well, I mean, it's totally counter to the notion of the Founding Fathers, which was that the House was the institution with a short election cycle in order for it to be responsive to public opinion. So if you go gerrymander all those seats, you create exactly the opposite effect. Yeah, I would say the Republicans have definitely gone much further to try to break up the comedy and break up the potential for bipartisanship. And I mean, the two examples I cited, I mean, I just have never conceived that a majority in the Senate would band together and write a letter to a foreign power in the midst of negotiations. If you did it afterwards, it still would be shocking, but while there's a chance you could actually disrupt it. And the invitation of Netanyahu and so on. I mean, there is a kind of going beyond the bounds that has happened on the Republican side that's more extreme. And then within the Republican Party, I mean, the notion that you've got this Freedom Caucus expanded at 45 members, I mean, toppling a speaker. I mean, people aren't paying much attention to Paul Ryan, but he's got a lot of trouble trying to get that budget through the House, and he's going to have to behave. I mean, we've got real institutional problems, which is the reason I'm out there saying, if you want to fix them, go fix them at the state level. You can't get them fixed at the Washington level.
Great. Okay, introduce yourselves and ask your questions. First question over here.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm an undergraduate here, an aspiring journalist, but you
Good.
mentioned the decline of print journalism. I was wondering if you have any advice to kind of get your foot in the door to turn journalism into a feasible career.
Yeah, is there anything that can be done to turn journalism into a feasible career and get your foot in the door? In the first place, it's very important to know that regardless of what the technological changes are and what the medium is, quality informational reporting and analysis will always survive and prevail. I mean, the institutions that are doing the best today are doing quality work. I don't mean just the New York Times, but if you go to South Bend, Indiana, the South Bend newspaper is no longer covering state politics as well as it used to. It's not covering the world as well as it used to, but is doing one hell of a job covering the whole region around South Bend, and people in South Bend want that paper. And they either get it in print or they get it online. So, I mean, you can go either way. The technology is changing, what it's going to look like, how you're going to communicate. I think you're going to be deciding a lot more about that than my generation is. But it's doable. It's a workable career. But you do have to have a lot of agility. You have to bring quality. You have to bring quality writing. You have to bring curiosity, absolutely driving curiosity, a drive to understand what's really going on. Whatever you're covering, whether it's sports or healthcare or politics or whatever. The best way to build a career, start right away. Start wherever you are. Start right here at Brown. Start, I don't know, where do you live?
Cincinnati.
Start in Cincinnati. Go in the summertime, or go before summertime and go talk to the people who run the Cincinnati paper, or if there's a good radio station there, there's a good television station there that you'd like to, go do it. What'll happen is that leads to other contacts, that builds an experience, it tells you what of this you really like to do. Oh, I'm really interested in this subject, or I like that kind of reporting, I don't like this. So, I mean, but do it.
Great. Tony, let me get you, oh, and Carolyn.
You located, it was a wonderful talk, and I really appreciate it, and I'm inclined to agree with almost everything, and yet you located the primary force for the current disenchantment in rising inequality. It seems as the sort of central problem, but the central fix you've offered is to operate at the state level and to push the politics at the local level.
No, I don't think we can, but you got to figure out where you can start. I mean, let's just take inequality of income on the minimum wage. Washington's stuck. 29 states now have higher minimum wages than Washington does. More than 60% of the American workforce is now working under a different minimum wage regime than there is in Washington. You just have these two big states, California and New York, put their workers on a path towards a $15. Does that fix the things? No. What it does is it starts to signal that motion is happening. Last election, I think 4 states that elected Republican senators raised the minimum wage, and we're talking about states: Arkansas, South Dakota, Alaska. We're not talking blue states. So that's number one. Number two. There are now 27 states that have passed legislation for B corporations. Do you know what a B corporation is? B corporation is a public benefit corporation in which the charter of the corporation allows it to pursue something in addition to maximizing profit and return to shareholders. Now, there are a lot of people who dispute whether or not federal law or even Delaware law prevents that. But there are a lot of corporate attorneys that are telling their CEOs, you can't do anything but pursue maximum return to your shareholders, or you can be sued and taken to court. There are now, 5 years ago, there wasn't a single law like this on the books anywhere. Maryland became the first state, 6 years ago, Maryland became the first state to pass such a law in 2010. There are now 27 states that have laws like that on the book. And there are now something like 1,200 public benefit corporations. The first one floated its IPO on Wall Street last summer. So there's another way in which you're dealing with the corporate sharing of wealth. There are proposals in the California legislature to give a tax cut or some kind of a tax benefit to corporations where the ratio between the CEO's pay and the average worker's pay is no more than 50 to 1. So people are starting at the state level to devise policies. The history of America tells us that when you start to have, as Louis Brandeis said, states as laboratories, that you start to get some of those policies adopted in Washington. I mean, I think it's important for people to have a sense that that there is movement and that something can be done. Can we eventually deal with these things without going to national policy? No. But at the moment, you can't. It's like saying, if you got to climb Everest, you got to climb Everest. But why not learn how to climb the hills for a while until you get to Everest? I mean, I think that's where. And if you look at the progressive era, for example, and if you look at the changes I was talking about in the 60s, you know, in each of those cases, a lot of those movements, gay rights has turned around. It began in Colorado and a bunch of states and worked its way around. You know, we're still torn up about that as a country. So I mean, the examples of political change and movements starting outside of Washington and eventually working their way to Washington, pretty good track record in our history. It's a good question, though.
Yeah, it is.
Hello, I'm Caroline. I teach in environmental studies, and
And public policy.
in public policy. That's right. I teach public policy, and my perception, and I think it might be shared, is that journalists are now kingmakers. So commentators on television, commentators in the news are actually as much kingmakers as they are simply objective, impartial reporters of the news. And I'm wondering if you'd comment on that. Is that your perception, or? I mean, even in this
Well,
election, I think that's problematic.
Let me just say a couple of things analytically. When we got rid of the smoke-filled room as the way to select, that is to have party power brokers essentially pick the nominee of the parties, and we went to a primary system. Then you put the voters theoretically in charge, but there always has to be some medium of communication between the politicians, and that definitely changed the role of journalists. So that historically goes back really to the McGovern reforms of 1972, okay, from that forth. Now, since then, I couldn't agree with you more about the role, particularly of the Washington Press Corps, and I've spent some time on some of those talk shows, so some of this commentary is directed at myself as well. I think part of the problem is that we've gotten away from the idea that reporting is our job. I mean, I tried to, I mean, when I got to the end and I dealt with you on what we could do, I became a citizen and an analyst, and maybe an advocate. But up until that point, trying to analyze what's been going on, I was trying to do my work as a reporter and as an analyst. I think the real problem with the Washington Press Corps in particular, and the people you see on television, is there's this constant pressure to predict, to project, and to tell you what's going to happen or what should happen. That's not our business. We really, I mean, we've really left the corral, and I think you're right to be unhappy with us. Part of the difficulty is that the ratings of shows that do that tend to be higher than the ratings of the show that do the dull, plodding job of reporting. So to a certain extent, the audience is helping to push journalists in the wrong direction. But I couldn't agree with you more that we've left, we've diminished our most important role. And Trump is a perfect example. I don't think it should have taken anybody until February to start writing that Trump, aside from all the horrendous things he's said and done, was tapping into some great economic angst that was telling us something about America. And I think if reporters had been doing their job, at least some of them would have been on that issue 3 or 4 months earlier. I can tell you without, I mean, I adjust what I say every audience, and certainly over a period of time. But the notion that Bernie and Trump were canaries in the gold mine, I certainly had in speeches that I was making last October. Okay, so it didn't take until February to discover that. It took some kind of decision to try to go analyze what's going on and to take them seriously, rather than simply try to cover the frosting of the campaign.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I wanted to go back to history, and I wanted to ask you in short, what happened to the Democrats in 1978? If you had a Democratic president and 2 houses of Congress dominated by the Democratic Party, do you think that, do you think there was some kind of very deep loss of faith in the New Deal and the Great Society that caused the whole ideology of the country to shift to the right? I mean, you know, a lot of mainstream people, not everybody, but mainstream people, in spite of the environmental movement and the women's movement and the civil rights movement, you know, I certainly can't explain it, but it seems like we've never really got back. Obviously, we've never got back there to, let's say, the ideals of Lyndon Johnson and, you know, that era or before. So I'm asking you this question not just to talk about history, which is fascinating in and of itself, but to ask if you really think that we have a chance of reestablishing the kind of, maybe you'd say, social compact that we had, that you talked about so well in the 1945 to late 70s era. I don't want to be, you were leaving us on an upbeat note, and there are things you can do, and that's great, and let's not.
I actually believe that.
Yeah,
I didn't just did it as a cheery ending. I was not putting a maraschino cherry on my
Exactly. And these are facts. These are facts. You're talking about laws, and these are facts they're going on. These movements and redistrict efforts to combat gerrymandering and all that. But so I don't want to sound too negative.
Let me take a shot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. I think there, particularly if you look at '78, and then you can look beyond that. In '78, I'm going to go back and just be a very hard-headed analyst. I was running the Washington Bureau at that time. We had a one-term Democratic president who had been a one-term governor in a one-party state. Not a formula for effective legislation, okay? Jimmy Carter did not know how to play the power game. I wrote this book, The Power Game, and I'm really contrasting Reagan and Carter, not as a Republican and as a Democrat, but as power players, understanding how the game was played. So in the first place, I didn't take the time to tell you, but Carter actually sent to the Congress a bill that would have worked along the lines not of Lyndon Johnson, but at least in that direction. He was going to raise the taxes on the wealthy, raise taxes on the corporations 2%, close some loopholes, and so forth. And he was so ineffective as a politician that the damn thing boomeranged when it came back. So number one, in terms of leadership at that time, the Democratic Party was very poorly led, okay, which encouraged the other side. Second thing that happened was partly as a result of Watergate. In the latter part of the 70s, you had several either freshmen, you had quite a few either freshman or sophomore Democrats in districts that had previously been Republican-leaning, not Republican, but Republican-leaning. And they felt extremely vulnerable headed towards the election of 1980. Not because Reagan was the nominee, it's even before Reagan gets in. And you had Powell's army that was going to work on them and saying, you got to take care of us or we're going to come get you. And that was very effective lobbying. Tip O'Neill said it's the most effective lobbying, that period of lobbying, it's the most effective lobbying he ever saw during all his time in Congress. Okay, so you had that going on. Then you had another phenomenon going on, which was an effort by either border state or marginal southern states like Arkansas, a fellow named Clinton, who were coming up with a Democratic Leadership Council and a different idea, the New Democrats, they were called, and they were basically sort of pro-business Democrats. What's going on is the Democrats are starting to realize, as the Republicans and as these lobbies start to move in with lots of money into campaigns, that they've got a guy named Tony Coelho, was very active in building the Democratic fundraising machine, and that they were raising money from corporations. So what happened was corporate power began to come in and leach its financial influence into the Democratic Party. You then began to have Democrats fashioning a political strategy aimed at those people. They were not deliberately trying to walk away from the New Deal. They were trying to keep in office. I mean, I think that's really how it begins. And then I think there's been a, what's the Will Rogers statement about if any party would, when he said, I'm a Democrat, I don't belong to any organized political party. That's it. Thanks for reminding me of the quote. They're very disorganized, and they have repeatedly made the mistake of not rallying to their standard bearer, and most strikingly in this 2014 election. I mean, the notion that Democrats were going to protect themselves in a midterm election by running away from a president whose rating was falling, that was a smart strategy. All you're going to do is cause his rating to follow further, which was going to endanger you more. So you should do, but that's like people selling as the market goes down and buying as the market goes up. The Democrats are equally foolish about, so they have not stopped and thought strategically for a long time. I don't know that you can just go back. I mean, Reagan was a very effective communicator at persuading a lot of people that government's the problem, not the solution. Well, that goes right to the heart of whether or not you're going to back the New Deal or not, right? So if you're going to come up against that, then you better start developing a way and saying, you know, government's helping small business, government's giving you the national parks, government's giving you protection on food and drug, and so forth. I mean, you better, as a party, if that's where your party position is, you better start doing it. They never, as a party, during this long period I've been following them, were never as purposeful as a party, even if they'd done it to a lesser degree. So I don't think it's just a loss of faith, although I think it turned into that. I don't think it began that way. I just think it's cascaded. The answer, is there a way to get back? Sure, because if you, I mean, California's a long way from here, but if you look at California's policies, some of the stuff that's done in California is truly amazing. I mean, the family benefit, the family leave, things, they're just chipping away at, back to this question of, can you make jobs better again? It isn't just the minimum wage. They're doing a bunch of other things. They're actually rebuilding a social compact there. Out of the 1,100 public benefit corporations, there are, I think, about 500 are in California. It's now become an ideology, a philosophy. It's become a corporate ethic that people are proud of. It's not like we're being defensive. This is the good way to go. And what's really interesting about the millennial generation is a lot of young people today want quality of work. They want to go work for a classy bank or a classy tech company or a classy something, but they want it to be a humane company. So there's potential pressure in that next generation on young and upcoming management to behave in a better way. And if you say, let's go back to Charlie Wilson, not a shot at that, because that's old-fashioned. But if they adopt the same ideas in a new context, that's modern and that's with it. And the business about gays and being more tolerant of minorities and transgender, all of that is a potential opening here for real change. But people have to be willing. What happened when Occupy appeared? What happened when the Tea Party appeared is there were some very smart people on the right who said, oh my God, this is a godsend, and they jumped in and they organized it. The Tea Party really started small. It was really populist. It wasn't headed for seats of Congress, but there were people who saw that as a great organizing, a great base, great passion, great prairie fire that they could ride. And on the other side, Occupy came along, and where was the DLC? Where was the AFL-CIO? Where was the Americans for Democracy? I mean, they never got together. They never wrote it. And it's part of the Will Rogers thing. So, I mean, some of it is thinking, but some of it is also sensing what the political moment is.
We have time for 2 more questions. Here's one.
Is that too long an answer?
No, it's a great answer. No, lots to it.
Hello, Mr. Smith. My name is Mara. I graduated from Brown/Pembroke 52 years ago, and I'm an immigrant. I know who still believes in government and America. It is the immigrants. And I think that's why we need them. We look to them. They're the hardest working people that and I have 2 children, both of whom went to the New York Times, their best education. One is still there, and the Times has that wonderful scholarship program, most of which the scholarships go to these immigrants with extraordinary stories. I just briefly want to say something about this Toynbee movement of tectonic plates and civilizations rising and falling. I catch your point. I take your point, but I do see hope, and we have a black president. We hopefully will have the first woman as president. We have health care. Yes, there are problems. No, I don't really have a question. I just have the glimmer of hope and the young lady who wants to become a journalist. My son went to art school and got to the Times through art school, so I don't really have a question. I hope you
Well, I
don't
love
mind.
your-
There is a question in there, I think, about immigration.
Yeah. Well, that's another one of those issues that we're incapable of dealing with because of a broken political system. I mean, you saw the way in which, I mean, it was actually remarkable in the current environment that the Senate was actually able to pass an immigration reform bill. But it got to the House. The House is now run by 45 people on the extreme right, and back to your asymmetrical analogy there. Yeah, do we need the refreshment of new people? we not only need the refreshment of new people, we got 11 million people we have already integrated into our economy, and we couldn't get along without them. And this notion that anybody thought we could send them home without paying a high price is, it's ridiculous.
And last question, with apologies.
Have you done any analysis on the impact of Citizens United on your two main drivers of ideas and power, and how this how do you overcome the impact of a Supreme Court decision?
Well, there's absolutely no question that Citizens United has had an enormous impact. I didn't mention it specifically today. I thought it was implicit, but by unleashing unlimited corporate contributions to political campaigns, you've allowed this hyper-concentration of wealth and economic power now to move into the political arena. And, the interesting thing is, and the terrible thing is the intersection between that and gerrymandering. Because, and people don't always make this connection. I don't know if you know it, but in a lot of districts, legislative as well as congressional districts around the country, the turnout in these party primaries is down somewhere 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%. It's really small. And so if you have a wealthy, independent super PAC, independent 501c4 that doesn't have to report its donors and it has corporate donors, either the corporation or its executives, they can go in and pinpoint districts in Rhode Island or in New Hampshire. I've actually been in New Hampshire when this happened, or in other states, and say, if you vote for this piece of legislation, we'll primary you. We'll run a primary against you in a place where they know the turnout is going to be under 2,000. And all they got to do is to turn out 1,200 people and move 1,200 people. And I mean, in New Hampshire, they were going through, and I was up there about 2 years ago, I think it was. Anyway, they were going through a vote over whether or not to extend Medicaid under Obamacare in the state of New Hampshire. And the governor, who's a Democrat, but has got a very divided legislature, very intelligently set up a bipartisan commission from both houses of the legislature to study the issue. And they came back with a virtually unanimous decision, Republicans and Democrats, in both houses, in favor of the expansion with some qualifications or whatever. And they came up with a plan. Literally the next day, Americans for Prosperity announced, and another conservative group announced that they were going to go after X, Y, and Z. And within 48 hours, X, Y, and Z had changed their vote, and the thing turned around. They didn't even have to hold an election. So that the threat of all that money coming in, particularly into congressional elections, less powerful than the presidential election because there's so much money that specific money doesn't have that importance. But in the congressional races that aren't watched and in legislative races, it's very powerful, absolutely. And it has a direct impact on policy, in state after state after state. ALEC is extremely well organized, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which actually was the primary force behind the voting rights laws that have been passed by 20 states in the last 3 or 4 years. They actually drafted the model legislation, and they did the same thing by concentrating the money, by going into the legislatures. They got a whole lot of stuff done, and it's going to take quite a long time to undo the damage that's been done there. So there's a direct impact, absolutely.
Mr. Smith will be, I'm sorry, I know you've got lots more questions. Before you clap, we'll be signing books. Mr. Smith will be signing books out there. So if you want to carry on the conversation out there, now clap. Thank you for a wonderful